If you identify a particular child, people are more willing to help, rather than if you just say there are thousands of children in need of help. So I think you're right. That is the way that we've evolved. We've evolved to help identifiable individuals because we've evolved living in small face-to-face societies where we could see all of the members of our tribe or group. We haven't changed since the world became larger and we started to have the capacity to help people far away who we can't identify. But again, that's an explanation of why we behave like this. It's not a justification for behaving like that. And that's what I want to emphasize, how we ought to behave rather than how we're likely to behave.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Crazy Money. This is your host, Paul Ollinger, and I am happy to be in your ears today as you go about living your life, doing what you're doing. Are you walking the dog? Are you driving carpool, running errands? Are you running upstairs in San Francisco, Matt Window? Is that what you're doing? Keep going, pal. Longer, stronger, faster. You're not getting any younger. Just saying. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you a question. Did you know that for the cost of a new television, you can save someone's life? That's right. For only $600, you can save the life of a fellow human being. Let me ask you something else. Would it be worth foregoing a nice bottle of wine to cure someone's blindness? That's right. For $50, you can provide cataract surgery to someone in the developing world, restoring their sight and giving them the opportunity to go back to work and provide for themselves and their family. How about this? Could you come up with $700 to fix a new mother's fistula? If you want to find out what that is, Google it, Fistula. It ain't pretty, folks. It's a debilitating condition that otherwise sentences that productive young woman to a life of incontinence and ostracism. But you can turn that around. These are the questions that Peter Singer wants us to ask ourselves as we go about our lives in the very affluent Western world, while many people in the developing world have their lives ruined for conditions that would take a trivial amount of money, relatively speaking, to solve. And we have the resources and we have the opportunity to provide that for them. We're going to talk to Peter Singer in this Encore interview from 2019 that is a perfect fit for the holiday season and to make those tax-deductible contributions before 2020 ends. Hey, but before we get there, let me say welcome to all our new listeners. Also, welcome to everybody who's joined the Crazy Money Listeners group on Facebook. It's growing quite nicely. Thank you very much. I appreciate your interest. Who's joined? Well, that's Sarah Schubert, Tim Abrams, Gina Miles, David Buechner, Barry Weiner, Rosie Castro, Dan Mulker, and Leo Gonzalez, a whole bunch of more people. And many of them I'm not even related to. I'm related to a lot of them. But join the party, y'all. On this group, you can post questions for future guests, comments about past guests, and suggestions for other guests you'd like to see. And I'm totally down for entertaining all of that. So by all means, come check it out. Go to Facebook, search Crazy Money Listeners, and you'll see links to it. Ask to join. You'll get in. It's pretty permissive. Anyway, join the party. Love to have you. So let's talk about Peter Singer, because this dude's the real deal. When this episode first aired, my friend Matt Johnson, who was a philosophy major at our alma mater, our shared alma mater, Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, he said to me, how in the world did you get Peter Singer to do your show? And that's the thing about having a pretty good podcast. You can go to the website of someone you admire whose work you believe is worth sharing, send them a note and say, can you find 45 to 60 minutes of your time to share with me and my listeners the next time I'm on the campus of Princeton University? And you'd be surprised who will say yes. And one day I talked to Peter Singer, whom the New Yorker called the world's most influential living philosopher, and Sir Angus Deaton, the Nobel Prize winner, who co-authored the study that found that there is no additional happiness in life past $75,000 of annual income. Pretty big hitters in an afternoon in New Jersey, don't you think? Anyway, while you may have never heard about Peter, he is very well known in the world of philosophy, philanthropy, the developing world, and animal rights. No, don't worry. We're not going to talk about the hamburger that you had for lunch today, but we are going to talk about the beautiful opportunity you and I and our fellow relatively wealthy Westerners, the opportunity that we have to use our money to change someone's life in the developing world. And I want to frame it through the lens of opportunity because having grown up Catholic, I hit my quota on guilt, shame, and obligation. And I don't believe that our motivation in life should be trying to avoid hell. I think our motivation in life should be that we have an opportunity to live our lives on a spectrum of morality, a spectrum of virtue. And that sounds kind of nerdy, but we have the opportunity to make our lives count. And the way we make it count is by using what we've acquired to help other human beings, whether that's our knowledge, our time, or our resources. And specifically for today, we're talking about resources, because what we consider to be a small amount of money can have massive impacts on the lives of other human beings. Peter is a professor of bioethics at both Princeton and the University of Melbourne. And like I said, the New Yorker called him the world's most influential living philosopher. Time magazine included him on their annual list of the world's most influential human beings. And a big part of his work is reminding those of us in the Western world that we have the opportunity to use relatively small amounts of money to make a huge impact in the lives of those in the developing world. We should avail ourselves of this because it is in our own enlightened self-interest. That any of us has an opportunity to live our lives on a spectrum of morality and goodness, and that doing this will help us find ourselves on the right end of that spectrum. Peter wrote a book called The Life You Can Save. It's available for free in both audio and ebook formats on his website, thelifeyoucansave.org, the link to which is in the show notes. On this site, you can plug in a dollar amount and just see the kind of wild impact it can have in the life of another human being. As I said at the top, for $600, you could save somebody's life. For $50, you can cure somebody's blindness. For $700, you can save a woman from ostracism by providing a surgery to fix her fistula. These are small amounts of money, relatively speaking, that have massive, massive impact. I hope you'll consider giving to thelifeyoucansave.org. If you don't feel it right now, hopefully you will after this conversation with Peter Singer. Professor Peter Singer, welcome to Crazy Money.
Thank you.
In 1971, you wrote an essay called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Can you summarize the main argument you put forth in that essay?
So I wrote Famine, Affluence, and Morality in the light of the crisis that was going on in what was then East Bengal and is now Bangladesh. And during that crisis, 9 million people fled across the border it was East Pakistan. It was called not East Bengal, though it was part of East Bengal as well. So 9 million people fled across the border into India, and India had great trouble, obviously, feeding and housing and providing sanitation for this vast mass of humanity escaping repression from the Pakistani army. So they appealed for aid, and some aid was forthcoming, but it was clear it wasn't really going to be nearly enough. I was then a graduate student in Oxford, and I was thinking about what are our obligations in this situation? Here am I living comfortably in an affluent country. I have not only enough to live on, but I have enough to plan a holiday going across the channel, touring Europe in the summer, things of that sort. Is that okay? Is that justifiable when there are people whose lives are in danger who I could be helping? So I started thinking about that, and I argued that, in fact, we do have significant responsibilities to help people in great need, where we can save lives or make a huge difference to their life at a relatively modest cost to ourselves. And I used a little analogy then, which has since become famous. I asked the readers to imagine that they were passing a shallow pond in a park when they saw that a small toddler had fallen in. And although they look around and expect parents or babysitters or someone to be rushing in to help the child, there's actually nobody else that they can see. So they can save the child quite easily. There's no danger to them because they know the pond is shallow, but they will ruin their expensive clothes that they've put on for some special occasion today. And I say, even so, wouldn't it be wrong not to save the child? Wouldn't it be wrong just to say, this child's not my responsibility. I didn't put the child in the pond. That would have been wrong, but I didn't do that. And go and walk on. And so I say to the readers, if you agree that that would be wrong, then why isn't it wrong to also walk past, more or less, or turn your eyes away from those people who are trying to raise money to help people in great need?
And you extended this argument much further in the book, The Life You Can Save, Acting Now to End World Poverty, which you'll be reissuing. It was originally published in...
It was published 10 years ago. This is going to be a 10th anniversary edition, so 2009 it came out.
You take your argument much further and you pose questions whether or not there are morally relevant differences between the drowning child and the child dying halfway across the world of avoidable poverty-related causes. As one who would want to poke holes in your story, you poke them for yourself and then run the counter-argument there.
That's what philosophers do, I think. We try to imagine objections, or sometimes, people have already made objections. Some of the ones I discuss in the book are ones that I didn't think up, but other people have made. And then we try to show how we would respond to them. Yeah, that's part of the the business of philosophy, not just to state a position, but to think of arguments against that position and see whether you've got convincing counter-arguments to those.
Those arguments might betray my own biases or heuristics of prioritizing, for example, that thing that is close to me as opposed to that thing that I cannot identify or is far away.
Yes, that's certainly a big factor, I think, in why, in fact, people don't help those who are far away. There are really two things that you mentioned just in that sentence. One is that they're close to me, and the other is rather than those I can't identify. And they're separate things because, of course, you could have people who are far away who you can identify, especially with modern digital media. That's not a problem. So one question is, does the fact that people are close to me rather than far away make a difference? Another question is, does the fact that I can identify individuals make a difference? And I think both of those are significant psychological factors, but I don't really think that either of them are an ethical justification for not helping people who are both far away and whom you cannot identify as individuals. So in terms of near and far, I think many people will accept that it's sort of, pretty intuitively obvious that that doesn't in itself make a difference. It might be relevant to how well you can know if your gift has actually achieved what you want, but that will depend on the kind of supervision and the kind of team that there is over in the country where you're helping people, whether they can reliably provide you with good information about the difference that your donation has made. The other question is the question of identifiable individuals. And as an example here, a program that has been shown to be highly effective in saving the lives of children under 5 is the Against Malaria Foundation's distribution of bed nets in areas where malaria is a big problem. But one of the psychological obstacles to people giving to that program is that, of course, you can't identify who you've actually helped, because it's not the case that every child sleeping under a bed net would have died without the bed net. If that were the case, then before there were bed nets, there wouldn't have been any people in that region. But we do know statistically that if you distribute a certain number of bed nets, it's likely that at least one child's life will be saved. But we never know which child. Mm-hmm. So you can never point to say, see, there's the child whose life I saved. And that's contrary, obviously, to some other conditions where you can help a particular individual and where maybe you can identify that individual and you can feel more satisfied. And that is often the case also when people are close to you, that you can see the people that you're helping. So I think that's, again, a kind of a psychological trait that we have that has been shown by research to make a big difference in how likely people are to help. But everybody is really a distinct individual, whether you know their name, their face, their age. They are just as much a person, or in this case a child, who needs help and who will otherwise die, and they will have real parents, even if you don't know exactly which parents it is. I think we really ought to focus more on where we can do the most good rather than can we see the individuals whom we're helping, can they thank us in some way? I don't think that's what we should be focusing on.
But we are programmed or have evolved to want to help individuals as opposed to some aggregate statistic, right? Where you mentioned a campaign where they used aggregate statistics, and I'm paraphrasing poorly, but bear with me, aggregate statistics to appeal to people to donate versus telling the story of one child that the donor could help. And the latter case was far more effective, presumably because one could put a face with the cause.
That's right. That is what the research shows. If you identify a particular child, people are more willing to help rather than if you just say there are thousands of children in need of help. So I think you're right. That is the way that we've evolved. We've evolved to help identifiable individuals because we've evolved living in small face-to-face societies where we could see all of the members of our tribe or group. And we haven't changed since the world became larger and we started to have the capacity to help people far away who we can't identify. But again, that's an explanation of why we behave like this. It's not a justification for behaving like that. And that's what I want to emphasize, how we ought to behave rather than how we're likely to behave.
So all of our evolved and learned behaviors aren't necessarily the best behaviors we could demonstrate?
No, because the world has changed. I mean, some of those behaviors are still well-suited for the societies that we live in and are important to maintain. But some of them are not because the world has changed, and where previously we couldn't make a difference to people far away whom we can't identify, now we can. And so that's at least one of those intuitions that I think we ought to say, yeah, we understand why this evolved, why it was useful for millennia of human development, but it's not what we ought to be doing now. In that respect, it's a bit like our attitudes to greenhouse gases, right? We don't have any evolved response to emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere because we never knew that this was harmful until 50 years ago. But we ought to still be thinking that this is harmful and this is the wrong thing to do, even if we don't have that kind of evolved response.
And my pushback as an individual to both greenhouse gases and helping starving or children with disease across the world is it might be futile. I don't know. I might not have the evidence or be convinced that my help will actually make a difference.
Well, I think you should be convinced that your help will make a difference, certainly in the case of helping people in extreme poverty. Because, again, just take this one example of using Against Malaria Fund to distribute bed nets. There's really good evidence that this does make a difference and that you're saving lives, depending how much you're able to give. Let's say you're able to give $5,000 to them, then there's really good evidence that you'll have saved at least one life and possibly more through that donation. If you're able to give only much less, then you're contributing with others to saving a life. So you can't say, I alone have saved a life by giving $50. It costs more than that. The bed nets only cost $2, but to give enough ad and to educate the families in using them, it'll cost more than $50 to save a life. But you're part of that process with others saving lives, so you are making a difference.
And my resistance to taking responsibility here is, I can say that it's either futile or it's not my responsibility or I'm giving in other ways. But your conclusion is that our current response to world poverty is not only insufficient, but morally indefensible.
That's right. I think for people as affluent as we are in the United States and Australia, the country where I originally come from, and a number of other countries, to give as little as we do is completely indefensible. And in saying that, maybe I should say that Americans often have a myth about how much their government gives. When you ask Americans in surveys, it's been done again and again, how much of the government's budget do you think goes on foreign aid? The answers range from, they're usually in the range of between 10 and 20%. Sometimes they go even higher. I think the average is around 15%. The correct answer is about 1% of government spending goes for foreign aid. And in terms of as a percentage of our gross national income, of everything that we earn as a country, it's less than 1/4%. So it's really very little compared to what we spend on a whole lot of things that are in no way necessary for us. The amount we give on foreign aid is really pretty trivial.
And what form does that aid take?
Well, there's both government and non-government aid programs. Some of the government aid programs are quite effective. I think the PEPFAR program that George W. Bush started, I think one of the best things that he did in his presidency is to help people who are HIV positive in developing countries to distribute the life-saving antiretrovirals to them and to help to prevent the spread of HIV/AIDS. That has clearly been a success and has saved a large number of lives. There are other successful programs also immunizing children against a range of diseases that they die from, including measles, although there's now this anti-vax campaign against measles. But in fact, the measles is a big killer of children in developing countries mostly, although now with the anti-vaxxers, we're starting to see more measles deaths in affluent countries as well.
What is the moral obligation of those who have money?
Well, I think their moral obligation is to use it wisely to do as much good as they can with it. Now, I'm not saying, that's all of their money. I certainly don't criticize people who give substantial amounts but still maybe live, very comfortable or even quite luxurious life. But I think you should think about how much do you really need, what resources do you have that you can use altruistically and not just for yourself and those personally close to you. And then you should think about doing that as effectively as possible. So you shouldn't just be giving on an impulse because you saw some advertisement with a picture of a smiling child from a developing country and you think, oh, that's a good cause. You should be looking at the research which is out there now, which organizations like GiveWell and The Life You Can Save, both organizations you can find online, have about which are the most effective organizations to give to, where you can do the most good. Then you should put those resources in that direction.
I pay my taxes. I'm good to my family. I tithe. Am I living an ethical life?
Well, the tithing is certainly good. We hope everybody pays their taxes and are good to their family. I guess whether tithing is enough depends on how wealthy you are. I think for some people in the community who don't have a lot to spare, tithing is already a significant amount that they're giving. There already maybe some things that they might like to buy that they won't buy because they're putting aside 10% of their income for effective non-profit organizations. So that's great. But if you're among the wealthier, then I don't think tithing is enough. At the back of the book, The Life You Can Save, I have a kind of a chart suggesting rising levels of giving corresponding with rising levels of income. As the income tax scale, for example, is progressive, you pay a higher rate if you earn more. So I think people who are wealthy ought to be thinking about that for their giving as well.
How much do I need to give? I need an answer, Professor.
I'm sorry, but
I came here for answers. I'm in Princeton, New Jersey. This is home of the truth, is it not?
It depends. You're going to have to tell me what your income is, and on that basis, I can tell you. Or if you'd rather not doing that, I can tell you the various levels that I have in that chart. At the really higher levels, they go up to a third of your income, and then they start coming down progressively to 25%, 20%, 15%. But I'm certainly suggesting that people who are earning over roughly $100,000 a year should be giving at least 5%. So that's less than a tithe. That's a half tithe, if you like. And then when you get up above that into the $250,000 sort of range, you should be. Well, I think that the tithe cuts in with my scale, if I remember rightly, around 150,000, and then as you get up to the 250,000, it gets up to 15 or 20% and goes up from there. But I hope people will take a look at the book, The Life You Can Save. It's going to be available free online, both as an ebook and as an audiobook, and the audiobook is read by a number of celebrities you might be interested in listening to as well. I think the audio book doesn't actually give all the figures because that's in the appendix, but the digital ebook does give the figures.
I'm sure there's a downloadable PDF that goes with the audio book.
Yes, that's true. That goes with the audio book. You're right. Yeah.
So I made $100 last week doing comedy. What bracket do I fall into?
If that's all you're living on, the $100, you're off the hook altogether.
Well, good. Let's not talk about net worth. Let's just stay with income for now. As I read your book, I started to think, and this is a horrible but perhaps natural response. As I'm reading this, and let's just say I do all this. Let's say I give away a third of my income. I was thinking to myself, what's the reward? Do I get into heaven?
No, I don't think you get into heaven because I don't think anybody gets into heaven because I don't think there is any such place.
Then what do I do? Why do I live this way?
That's a pretty primitive concept.
It's absolutely primitive, and I acknowledge that, and I apologize for my primitivity.
That's fine. Look, I rather think that the rewards are internal. The rewards are the sense of fulfillment that you can have from knowing that you've done a lot of good in the world, that your life has been a positive thing, not only for you, but for others, that it hasn't just been that, you've lived and had some various pleasant experiences and then you've died, which in a sense is kind of meaningless. And I think, we like to have some sense of meaning, and even if we don't find that in any kind of religious conception, we can still have it in thinking it mattered that I lived, and it mattered for the good that I lived. It made the lives of others better. It made the world in a limited way a better place because of the fact that I was here and the choices that I made.
So tell me a little bit about enlightened self-interest. Seems to be a related concept.
Yes, exactly. This is a kind of, so people will see giving as a sacrifice, but I think that's a narrow sense of self-interest in which it's a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice if you think of self-interest as, how many toys can I buy? How many of the latest trendy things can I buy? Can I have a really expensive watch on my wrist, or drive a really expensive car, or wear famous brand clothes, or carry famous brand handbags? And I think that that's a really misguided sense of self-interest, and there's a good amount of research that shows this as well, that when people spend on consumer goods, it gives them a bit of a boost for a short time, but they adjust to it and it fades away. Whereas when people help others, that seems to be a more lasting kind of sense of satisfaction. And as I say, there is good research which not only shows the correlation between giving and being happier and more content with your life, and that's very well established, but some of the research shows the direction of causation as well. And it shows that the direction of causation is from giving to being more satisfied with your life.
And the degrees to which you believe we should be giving are far greater than the societal norms today. You say it may not be possible to consider ourselves to be living morally good lives unless we give a great deal more than most of us would think is realistic to expect human beings to give. You're pulling a little bit of the ancient mariner here on us, and the wedding guest is walking away a wiser but sadder man, right?
Yes. So I think that it's true that, we tend to think at the moment that just quite small amounts are sufficient. I know that, you suggest to people that they might give and they say, I gave $50 or I gave $100 or whatever. And these are fairly wealthy people for whom that's really nothing and that makes no difference to the way they live. I think we need to add some noughts to that. But the scale that I'm proposing isn't going to impoverish anybody. It's not really going to mean that people can't have good, comfortable, materially comfortable lives and provide for their children and loved ones. But it's rather that instead of thinking about some of those things that people spend on, particularly the status goods, which I think are really crazy. I was talking to somebody who had a friend who'd paid $40,000 for one of these mechanical watches and had to take it back to the dealer because it wasn't keeping time properly, right? Whereas, you can buy a $50 electronic watch that keeps time beautifully. So, that kind of spending, I think, is really nuts. And people who are contemplating that should instead think about how much good that sort of money can do and really how much more meaningful it will be to them to know that they've helped other people than to be able to flash this expensive brand watch on their wrist.
I may have a very expensive piece of machinery in my sock drawer at home that I don't feel good about right now. So let's talk about how can we, you outline several causes in the book that really are, you can make a very large difference in a person's life in a few different ways. You mentioned malaria, which we've talked about a little bit. What about some of the other?
So one obvious thing that people can easily relate to is preventing blindness or restoring sight in people who are blind. So here's something that people in an affluent country can relate to. Getting cataracts removed, right? So it's pretty common as people get older, they develop cataracts, their vision becomes blurred. In some cases, they will become blind as a result of that.
But that's got to cost thousands of dollars to remove a cataract.
No, it doesn't. It costs less than $100, basically. Most of the estimates vary a bit, but some say $25. I think actually that's a little bit low. But I think it certainly can be done for less than $100. And when you think about that and how much difference it makes to someone to regain their sight, and not only does it make a difference to them, it makes a difference to others because if they are blind, they're often dependent on somebody else. They need, say, somebody to help them through life, and they can't themselves be as productive as they could. When you restore their sight, they become more productive and they don't need as much help. So it's a huge gain for a very modest amount of money.
Fistulas. I hadn't heard of fistulas.
Right. Most people haven't. So a fistula basically just is a kind of medical jargon for a hole. But the kind of fistulas we're talking about here, known as obstetric fistulas, come during childbirth, particularly when the woman giving birth is not really strong and healthy. Maybe she's a bit young for giving birth to children, or maybe she's not very well nourished. And secondly, she's giving birth in a place where she cannot get medical help. And of course, that's the situation for many people in rural areas in developing countries. So what can happen then is that the birth becomes obstructed. The baby can't get out, and it's kicking and moving. And that goes on for many hours, and it wears a hole. The baby wears a hole in the uterus, and that hole may go through to either the bladder or the bowels or both. So that means the woman, assuming she survives this process and the baby is eventually born, the woman is now incontinent. She's either incontinent of urine or of feces or both, and she can't really keep clean in the circumstances in which she's in a developing country where there's, not great sanitation. It's very difficult for her to keep clean and not to smell badly. So, her husband is likely to abandon her at that point. She may go back to her family, but her family can't really live with her either. They may build a little hut separate from their own place and put her there. So it's a young woman's life that is basically ruined for many decades that she may still live with this condition. Now, again, this is a treatable condition. There is surgery that can be done that in almost all cases can repair the fistula, the hole, and she can go back to a normal life. That's been estimated to cost around $700, so it's more than restoring sight. But again, it's not a significant amount of money to many middle-class or affluent Americans or others. So it's, again, something that we can do that is truly life-transforming for a young woman at relatively modest cost to ourselves.
You profiled a doctor who did work, and so profiling him, again, I'm paraphrasing, doing a poor job of it, you raised the question of where the responsibilities to my own children, where do those become less significant than my responsibilities to an unidentified child halfway across the globe?
Right. You're thinking about Paul Farmer, who was a Harvard medical graduate who went to work in Haiti because he saw the need among the rural poor in Haiti as being so much greater than back in Massachusetts. And then he developed this organization. He got some financial support called Partners in Health that is helping people in other countries as well. And he had a child himself, and he would carry the picture of his child around in his wallet. And then he realized that there were these other children who he was helping, whose lives he could save, and he wasn't thinking about them. And he felt that he should remind himself about them. So then he started carrying the picture of one of these children. In a way, he was using this idea of an identifiable child, but he was using that one identifiable child as a kind of a token for all of the children that he could help. So he was, admittedly a fairly driven person who always felt torn between wanting to spend time with his own child and his wife and the knowledge that he could be doing good for other children. And it's very hard to say where to draw that line. I mean, personally, I obviously do give a lot more attention and care and concern to my own children and now my grandchildren than I do to strangers, but I still try to make sure that I am not overdoing this, that I am thinking significantly about the well-being of others and both donating myself to help them as well as spending time talking about these issues, writing about these issues, and trying to make more people aware of them.
Looking a bit more broadly in the world, extreme poverty is declining while inequality is increasing both across the world and within countries. Is the world making moral progress?
I do think the world is making moral progress because of the decline in extreme poverty and the decline, for example, in the number of children under 5 who die. UNICEF puts out figures of the number of children who die before their 5th birthday each year. When I published the first edition of The Life You Can Save 10 years ago, that figure was 9.7 million. Now in the new updated edition, it's 5.4 million, so it's almost halved. That's a big drop in just 10 years, and it's definitely a sign that we are making progress. But there are reasons for concern about whether we'll continue to make progress at the same pace. One of them, of course, is climate change, the fact that things are getting less stable in the climate, and that means that when you have rural people who are dependent on rainfall to water their crops for them then to eat and survive, climate change can vary those rainfall patterns. It can also provide more scorching heat at periods when the crops are in the ground that might burn them off. So there are serious questions about whether we can continue to reduce the number of people in extreme poverty, continue to reduce the number of children and adults who are dying from poverty-related causes. I hope we can, but it's not going to be something we can take for granted that we will eliminate poverty.
There are those that say that global aid isn't effective. What are ways that we could be improving global aid to make it more effective?
The claims that global aid is not effective are usually made with reference to government aid or aid from multilateral institutions like the World Bank. And it's true that some of this has not been effective. Some of this has given governments in low-income countries the opportunity to shirk their responsibilities. So there are problems about that. But when we're talking about aid from non-government organizations, then I think it's often a different story. Again, not always. Of course, not all of these organizations are doing a good job. But that's the point of having the research to assess which ones are. And that's why it's such a different situation now that we have organizations like GiveWell, who I think employ about 25 people full-time doing this research, and they have no ties to any of the organizations they're assessing. They're a completely independent organization. The Life You Can Save is also promoting similar ideas and trying to get people aware of which are the most effective organizations to donate to. So it's easy now for people to go to one of those websites and sort out which are the effective organizations from the less effective ones. And so I think we don't need to worry about this idea that, quote, global aid is not effective. That's too sweeping, too broad a statement. And, unless you are planning to make your gift to the World Bank, which is probably not very likely, then the criticism of those institutions and of government aids is not really very relevant. What's relevant is, do we have the opportunities to give effectively, to make a real difference to the lives of people in great need? And the answer to that is unequivocally yes.
Dear World Bank, please accept this donation.
That's right.
One of the challenges, seems to me, is that we as Westerners impose our way of thinking and think, oh, well, what they need is a school over there, without really understanding the needs on the ground or whatever. And you talk about an organization that used media to help prevent disease in Africa. It just kind of opened my eyes to how little I knew about what was going on the ground over there.
Yes, you're certainly right that we need to listen to people there rather than imposing our ideas on them. And good organizations do that, and they don't offer interventions that the people don't themselves want.
Like, we could send Gatorade and sweatshirts over there.
Yeah, and in fact, sending all your used clothes arguably depresses the industry in developing countries where they can make their own clothing. Mm-hmm. So there are certainly issues that you need to think about of that. But providing people with bed nets, helping people to start small businesses where they want to do that in villages, an organization called Village Enterprise that does that, provides them with some seed capital or goods, trains them, mentors them in running a business, helps them to set up a savings group so that there's sort of greater financial strength in the village. Those things work. They've been shown to work, and people want them. And you mentioned Development Media International, DMI, which has shown that radio advertising in a number of countries, they started in Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries of West Africa, actually saves lives, telling people about the kinds of health conditions that they or their children might experience, and when do they need to get to a clinic, and when they don't. I have testimony in the book from somebody who had a child who was sick, and they didn't really know what was wrong with the child, and they hadn't, I think maybe they hadn't gone to any conventional medical clinic or anything like that to help. They'd tried some home remedies which hadn't helped. And then they heard the radio advertisement, and they realized that the symptoms of the child were of malaria, and they took the child to a clinic, and she was treated with the appropriate drugs, and she survived. And they now call her the radio child because she wouldn't have been there if they hadn't had a radio.
And the parents thought she was under a curse.
That's right. They did, actually, yes. That was part of the traditional village belief.
So the value of fundamental basic education is paramount in terms of helping them help themselves.
It is, and I think in a way that's an example. Some people will say, well, everybody's culture has their own beliefs and they're all as good as others. But clearly that
sound like it.
Exactly. It's not always the case. And if people believe that a child who has malaria is under a curse and therefore they don't get the appropriate treatment for it, then that's not a belief that you want to preserve or you want to regard as equally valid. And, of course, the parents themselves accept this once they see that she was close to dying because of the traditional remedies for a child who's under a curse. And then they took her to get the drugs at the clinic, and she quite soon became better again. Then they understand which are the more valid beliefs here.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about your career. How does one decide to become a philosopher?
There's a lot of accidents in choices of careers, and mine is certainly no exception. When I got to the stage where I was choosing a university course to enroll for, I was planning to do law. And in Australia, where I was at this time, you do law as an undergraduate degree. You don't have to do something other degree first. I was interested in law, and I thought I would be a lawyer. my sister...
You're into M&A law. How different your career may have turned out.
Different it could have been, yeah. Well, who knows what sort of lawyer I might have been. I like to think maybe I would have gone into sort of public interest law and helped people in poverty or refugees or something.
You could be on TV right now.
I can't promise that. Huh?
Been in an accident? Call Peter Singer.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, so my sister had this boyfriend who she later married, so he became my brother-in-law, who had done some philosophy. She's older than me. And I talked to him a bit about it and sounded interesting. So I thought I will do a bit of philosophy on the side, maybe while going through the law degree.
Philosophy is a side hustle.
Yeah, well, because you could do combined law arts degrees as well. But I got interested in it, and I finished the BA before I'd finished the law degree, and I did well enough to get offered a scholarship to go on to do graduate research.
That was at Cambridge?
No, this was in Australia.
Oh, okay.
I then subsequently, after I'd done a master's degree, I then got offered another scholarship to Oxford. Not Cambridge. Sorry, you've got to get the right one.
Right, sorry.
Very important.
I'm talking to another Cambridge person later today.
Okay, that's the other place we refer to that. We prefer not to mention the name.
Sorry.
Yeah, so that was basically one thing leading to another. If I hadn't been offered this scholarship to do graduate work, I would have finished my law degree. And as you say, who knows what kind of lawyer I would have become. And then if I hadn't got an offered scholarship to Oxford, I still might have gone back and completed the law degree because that option was still open at that point. And by the time I went to Oxford and did a degree there and then got offered a job at Oxford where I taught for a couple of years, it was getting a bit late to go back to law by then. And
right.
Anyway, I was enjoying philosophy and I seemed to be doing well enough in it. My father originally said when I was doing philosophy, he said, well, how can you make a living in philosophy, right? But by the time I'd finished my 2-year teaching job at Oxford, I guess I felt I was doing well enough that I may be able to make a living in philosophy.
And how did you pick a focus?
That sort of was easy because I was always interested in areas of philosophy that had an impact on real life. So there are a lot of interesting philosophical problems that have no impact. So how do I know that I'm not dreaming now, right? How do I know that you're not somebody in my dream interviewing me, or a little more sophisticated because this is maybe a bit more vivid than a dream? How do I know there's not somebody who's drugged me and put electrodes connected to my brain and is programming me? This kind of situation. Well, strictly speaking, I don't know that, right? It's very hard to prove that is not the case, and that's an ancient philosophical debate. But nobody really changes their way of living because they think, oh, maybe I'm lying in a vat with electrodes plugged into my brain. There's nothing that you can do about that. Whereas questions about how ought I to live, what should I be doing with my spare cash, is it okay to eat meat, what should I think about abortion, or what should I think about end-of-life decisions in medicine, or those sorts of questions obviously had an impact on real life. So from a pretty early stage in my career, even as an undergraduate, I was focusing on ethics and political philosophy rather than on metaphysics or epistemology or some of these other areas.
And I'm gathering that you don't measure your success by how big your paycheck is, but how do you measure your success and your happiness in your work?
My happiness in my work comes, I guess, in two different ways. One of them is the intellectual interest of the work. I enjoy the process of understanding something that's complex and sorting out my own views on that and then writing it down in a way that expresses it. And if my colleague philosophers feel that that's worthwhile and worth discussing, that's also rewarding. But it's not, as I said, sufficient for me. I do want to have a broader impact. I think philosophy has something to contribute to the real world. I know through my teaching, I've had a number of students whose lives have changed because of the issues that I've raised in class, issues about the sorts of things that we've been talking about with in terms of helping others, and also issues about concern for animals and what we do to them in factory farms. So that's rewarding. And then if I can write books that have a larger impact or do interviews like this one, for example, that let's hope millions of people will listen to.
At least millions.
Yes. So if there are millions, then we can be pretty confident that some of them are going to respond to this in a positive way. And getting feedback about that and knowing that people are responding positively is immensely rewarding for me too.
Let's talk a little bit about your organization, The Life You Can Save, and what you hope to accomplish by reissuing the book.
So The Life You Can Save is an organization that spun off the first edition of this book that came out, as I said, in 2009. And at first it was just a friend who said, you should have a website associated with the book so that people who don't read the book can read your views about why they ought to give and how much they ought to give, and they can go online and pledge publicly to give. So the website was just doing that for a year or two until I got a call from a guy called Charlie Bressler who told me that he'd had a successful career in men's retailing, men's clothing retail industry. But that had never really coincided with his values. He'd never sort of also, slid into that backwards, had a PhD in psychology and had never really intended to go into business. But he'd made a reasonable amount of money, but he felt now as he was getting into his 60s that he actually wanted to do something that did fit his values more.
So he got into heaven. That's what he was thinking about. He's thinking about heaven.
He's thinking about his enlightened self-interest, no doubt, but also,
call it whatever you want to call it.
Indirectly, of course, about helping others and feeling good that he's doing that. And he has actually told me as a joke, because the book is called The Life You Can Save, he said, well, the life you saved is my own, because he really feels that this has been much more fulfilling. And so anyway, what he called up to say was, do you want somebody to really build this up into an organization? And he said, if so, I'm willing to do that purely as a volunteer. I don't want to be paid. And in fact, he's become a substantial donor to the organization. So I tell him he's on a negative income, negative pay. But he's done that very successfully, I think. He's built up the organization, raised some funds for it, can now employ a small number of staff, doesn't have any offices. The staff work out of their own homes, but you can work that way. And it's having a big impact in terms of for every dollar that the organization spends, something like $13 gets donated to effective charities. That's donations that we can track through the website and through the organizations that are receiving the money. So it's a way of giving that has a lot of leverage, really, that you can give and you can multiply the amount you're giving. And I think it's really important to try to spread this message, to try to get people to know that there are organizations that have been vetted for their effectiveness that you can give to with confidence, and to get people to think more about exactly what we've been talking about. Here I am living in an affluent country, middle income or above. I provide for my family. What else should I be doing to be living an ethical life? And one of those things is helping people who are much less fortunate than you are.
Discussing the need to be on the same page as one's spouse when it comes to giving. So what is the process to agreement like in your own marriage?
Well, there's two stages to it. If there's something that's small, I'm talking about a couple of $100s, then it's fine. We don't have to discuss it with each other. When we're talking about the big gifts that we do at the end of the year, and I'm talking about tens of thousands of dollars now, we talk about that and we reach agreement on where those more substantial amounts are going. And it is basically either to the Life You Can Save itself or rather more to the recommended charities of the Life You Can Save. Plus, I also give to some of the most effective organizations trying to reduce the suffering of animals, because that's an issue I've been concerned about for a long time. And there is also an organization called Animal Charity Evaluators that tries to evaluate the effectiveness of animal charities.
How did you come to an agreement on how much of your salary, which is a pretty big amount? If you care to put a percentage on it, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I don't mind saying that. It varies a little bit with what our financial commitments have been as compared to how much we have available to give. But certainly for at least the last decade, we've been giving at least a third of our income each year. And sometimes it's got pretty close to 50%. We haven't actually passed the 50% line as yet, but we're working in that area.
Do you give to any local or arts organizations?
No.
Does that make you persona non grata in your neighborhood?
No, I don't think people really, care about that. There's nobody that's asking me to give to a particular local organization, or if they do, they certainly understand when I say, yeah, thanks, but I think my money does more good when I give it to one of these, and then I name some of the other organizations that I'm giving to, whether it's Oxfam or Against Malaria Fund or Developing Media International or Village Enterprise. those organizations that we've talked about. I suppose with the arts issues, it's kind of interesting because, and for that matter, you could add higher education, right?
Well, that's what I was going to say. What about the Princeton Faculty
Right.
Fund? Surely somebody's asking you for that. I used to do that. That was my job.
No, actually, faculty don't get asked to donate
Really?
money here. No, certainly the alumni do all the time. There's a very sophisticated development office. But my students often ask me that. They say, because they're already, know that they're being lined up for donating. So they say, well, do you think I should donate to Princeton? And I have to say, look, Princeton has an endowment of something like $21 billion at the moment. And it's a great university, and it's wonderful that it can give people a good education, including, I should say, people who do not have the means to pay for Princeton. Over 50% of our students are on financial aid. So that's an excellent thing. But is it the best value you can get for your dollars? I really find that hard to say. And I have in the past had people from the development office, to give them a chance to have their say on this issue if they want to, about why giving to Princeton is good. And they're prepared to say, well, don't give only to Princeton. There are other good organizations, but do give something to Princeton.
That's a tough 45 minutes for a development officer to come into your classroom and do that.
I suppose it is, yeah.
So, Peter, people can find out more about all these organizations at thelifeyoucansave.org. They can also get the free download of the book there, correct?
That is correct, and they can get either an ebook to download, or they can get the audiobook, and the audiobook has chapters read by a number of different celebrities.
Who are we going to find there? Let's tease with some hashtags here.
Right. So biggest name from my generation anyway is Paul Simon of Simon and Garfunkel.
Indeed.
And he's been very helpful. He's certainly a philanthropist interested in helping people. We also have Kristen Bell, well known from Frozen and from the program The Good Place. In fact, The Good Place was director Mike Schur was very helpful. I contacted him and because the program discusses ethical issues, and I noticed one or two of my arguments got mentioned there.
Oh, that's interesting.
So he's written a foreword for the book, which he reads. He also got Kristen Bell to read a chapter, and Mark Evan Jackson as well, who's somebody else who's on that program.
That's awesome.
Then we have Shabana Azmi, who is a very famous actress in India, and the book will be released in India as well because there's a lot of wealth in India as well as a lot of poverty, and we're trying to spread these ideas to India too. Winnie Alma is an African woman who has been working in the development area, and she's read a chapter. Natalia Vodianova is a very famous Russian model. She's a reader. Stephen Fry is somebody who listeners to the BBC would know well, has a beautiful voice and has presented many programs and interviews on the BBC. So I think we have a very good selection of people reading.
Got a whole host of global celebrities to help you spread the word.
That's right, yep.
Well, this has been a really terrific conversation. I appreciate your time, and I thank you for your work. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks very much, Paul. Been good talking to you.
Once again, thank you to Peter Singer for taking the time to speak with me and share his message. I think it's a really important one, and one that if we were to act on it, we would actually increase our feelings of wealth and prosperity, because there's nothing that makes you feel better and more empowered about your own life than giving away a little bit of your own money. So I'm going to start that as our takeaway right there. Share your assets, folks, whether it's $50 or $5,000. It will remind you about how blessed you are. You, for a moment, will begin to compare your life, not to the person that's got a bigger house or a nicer car, but to the person who is halfway around the globe and struggling at the most fundamental levels of existence. And you, kind, generous, wealthy person that you are, have the opportunity to change that. So click on the link to thelifeyoucansave.org and make a donation today. You can donate it to one of several charities doing the work that most resonates with you. Second, you are more powerful than you think. This is a great opportunity for you to exercise some power. Feel that moment of exhilaration when you say, I want to cure somebody's blindness, and this $100 or $500 wills it to be so. Click, bam, look at you. You're in charge. You're the person. You're the man. You're the woman. You're the human. You keep going. Lastly, virtue is its own reward. The Stoics say this. A lot of religions say this. And I love the fact that the world's most influential living philosopher called me primitive when I asked him what my reward was, that do I get to go to heaven or whatever? God, that was cool. I am a little bit primitive, but I think I asked that on behalf of all of us who think about, well, if I do this, don't I get a reward? And that's sort of, that is kind of primitive. So let's focus on the fact that in this instance, using your assets to change somebody else's life is optimizing your own enlightened self-interest, because it'll make you feel good, if nothing else. And you will have made a difference in someone else's life. That's a powerful thing. All right. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. I really appreciate it. And I also appreciate all the support that has come back my way in the production of this podcast in 2020. It's been a bizarre year, but man, I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity to bring a lot of these brilliant people to you and that you've found it worth your time. So thank you. Keep it going. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. And Mike Carano, make me sound smart.